The CSO published their survey on income and living conditions today for 2020. I'm sure some of you will have seen it. And a number of different figures stood out. There's a huge amount in it. But what stood out for us is that when you take mortgage and rents out of people's disposable income, an amazing 20% of the population apparently are at risk of poverty. About 1 in 5 people, imagine that, once you take out mortgage and rent from their disposable income. It just gives a sense of how housing costs can cripple people in this country. Barra Rowntree is an economist with the ESRI and he joins me now. Barra, does this surprise you at all?
No, not really, unfortunately, but that's just the way that this has been for a long time. So we know that those who are renters are much more likely than homeowners to be at risk of poverty. So the figures for 2020 that you're talking about show that even before you take into account those housing costs, it's about 35% of renters, 28% of renters, versus about 7% of homeowners are at risk of poverty. That's below that kind of poverty line that we talk about. And it's even higher, it's about 35% in material deprivation. So that's not being able to afford things like a new pair of shoes or a joint of meat. So these kind of inequalities are long-standing, and we know that that's been the case for a long period of time. But it does just go to show just how much housing and incomes are kind of interrelated and tied together.
Now, there'll be some people who might suggest, well, yeah, look, housing though is the biggest kind of outlay in most homes. It's understandable that kind of people's disposable income would be obliterated to a degree once you take out the mortgage costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's true. But we also know that renters, about research by the ESRI has shown that more than about a third of those in the private rental sector pay more than 30% of their income in rent. So yes, it is true that for a lot of people these housing costs are big relative to their income, but we know that's much truer for those who are renting, and particularly those who are in the private rental sector. So you mentioned earlier on that that those who are in receive of housing reports like HAP, many of them experience poverty, but really the reason for them is that they have such low incomes, whereas you have another group, those in the private rental sector in particular, who face very, very high housing costs relative to their incomes, which for many can be actually quite high.
And how has that picture changed in recent years?
So in recent years what we've seen is really that trend accentuate. So we've seen with rising rents rapidly over recent years, particularly in the private rental sector, that it's those guys who aren't really insulated from those pressures, and so we've seen the share who experience this very high level of housing costs rise over the last few years.
I mean, this is a kind of a very simplistic binary option I'm giving you, but I assume to right this wrong, you either make the housing cheaper or you increase the level of their disposable income.
Ideally both, but fundamentally that's what it comes down to. Yes, and so then really is all about the policies that act to both boost people's incomes in the longer run. But maybe we don't know the magic bullet always to that. But then in terms of housing, we do know what's needed there. We need more supply, and in particular affordable and social housing supply.
And I'm conscious. I mean, if you focus more on the former, the boosting the boosting people's incomes, there's a lot of talk recently about kind of the inflationary spiral you can find yourself in. That can be complicated as well. Rents will chase that increase wages, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if there was a magic bullet that we knew would increase income growth, you would hope we'd already be doing it. So it's not the type of thing you should be leaving on the table.
Rory Hearne is with us as well, Barra. If you stay where you are, he is assistant professor in social policy in Maynooth University and the author of Housing Shock: The Irish Housing Crisis and How to Solve It. Rory, I assume, much like Barra, you're unsurprised by this.
Unsurprised, yeah, Kieran, but I think shocked again to a certain extent in looking through it in terms of who is actually being affected and that kind of growing gap between, this really is renters. Now, I'll qualify that slightly in that the figures, and maybe Barra can come back on this, my understanding is that the figures for those who have mortgages, homeowners, which is much, much lower than renters in terms of affected by poverty, might be masking people at different stages in their life who might be more affected. For example, if you're in your, with young family and high mortgage costs, how that might be. But irrespective of that, what really jumps out here is that renters are being hammered to the point of being pushed into poverty. And for your listeners to get a sense of this, what we're talking about here is people whose annual income would be less than this annual disposable income, should I say, that is what they have to spend after, would be less than 14,000 a year. This is really people who are struggling. And what we're seeing is that, as you said yourself, a third now of renters who get no state support are in poverty after they pay their rent. I was looking to it further. What this means in terms of children in poverty in this country is that prior to housing costs, about 200,000 children are in poverty, but after housing costs, an additional 100,000 children are left in poverty, bringing it to 1 in 4 children in the country are in poverty after housing costs. And as I said, it is really renters, and again, you can burrow down more into the figures. I've looked at them. You know, people who are, for example, unable to work due to long-standing health problems, 50% of those are in poverty after housing costs. One-parent families similarly jump from 20% being in poverty before housing costs to 50%, half being in poverty after housing costs. And I think that this is really showing the human, I call it, it's a social catastrophe that's going on out there for renters. This is really, a cost of living crisis that has been building for years, but people can't sustain this.
Let me just go back to Barra, just on that point in the mortgages, Barra. I suppose, like the demographics of mortgage holders is probably more varied than the demographics of renters. Is maybe the point that Rory was getting at. So kind of, a single snapshot maybe doesn't tell the entire story of the kind of the mortgage holder situation in the country. Yeah,
that's right. And I suppose there's an important point here as well, is when we're talking about housing costs, or when certainly the CSO is talking about housing costs, what they're talking about for homeowners is the interest component of your mortgage, so not the capital repayments, because you can think of those capital repayments as saving. You're getting an asset in exchange for it. And so from that point of view, the comparison with renters is really that with renters, you're not getting anything for that. That's a cost of kind of consumption that's gone. And so we've had low interest rates for many years, and that's been something a bit of despite the change in house prices, really the low interest rates have meant that most mortgage holders are paying very little. And then again, I suppose on top of that, there's most people who own their own home own it outright. Or certainly many, a large share. So there's a bunch of people who have almost zero housing costs. So that's really kind of what's going on, and as you say, the diversity of the circumstances that homeowners have.
Rory, Barra as well mentioned, kind of being in poverty or at risk of poverty means you can't buy the new pair of shoes or pay for the joint meat. The type of simple things that a lot of us are lucky enough to be able to take for granted. From a wider point of view, from a societal point of view, like what is the impact of that many people being at risk of poverty or living in poverty?
Well, I suppose what we're seeing now is a situation whereby, it's having really wide societal impact. If we look at it in terms of, we know as well that the rents are taking away from people's, for example, savings to be able to save a deposit, which means people, are less likely to be able to buy their home, which we also know has impacts on household formation, on people having children, decisions to have children, for example. We look at as well in terms of the rents. And, the government has put itself in this illogical position whereby, because it has allowed rents to rise year after year after year, it is also now increasing its required spend on supporting people in the private rental sector through things like the housing assistance payment. We are now close to spending $1 billion a year of public money into private landlords to people who can't cover the rent. Like, that is just phenomenal. And it's when you talk about social policy and we look at what we've done, like, it does come back to the real failure over the last 20 years was not building social housing, affordable housing by the state. And I would argue we really haven't shifted policy fundamentally on that yet. So where are we going with this? I think unless there's a freeze properly on rents and unless there's mechanisms to reduce rents at some level, we're going to see rising poverty amongst renters. And unless there's a significant increase in that build, as Barra says, of social and affordable housing, and I'm talking like a very significant build beyond what is actually set out in Housing for All, I think this crisis will continue for renters in particular and for those in low and average incomes.
I know lots of people listening to this are renting and are maybe struggling to pay that rent, or certainly struggling to save any money or put anything aside after they pay that rent. If you fall into this category, I should have said, and you want to get in touch and share your own story and maybe examples of the things you've had to forego, 53106 is the text number. You mentioned Housing for All, Rory. You're not confident, I suppose that lots of people are not confident we can even hit those targets. You're not confident even if we hit those targets that it will be enough?
No, if you look at it, for example, and I'll give you a really good example. The government says they're going to provide or build 10,000 new social housing units per year. If you look at that, at the moment, there is in the region of 16,000 new people entering the HAP system, 16,000 households, should I say, a year, who are in need of housing, who have to get the support additional each year.
Yeah.
So the number of new built social housing doesn't even cover the number of new people who need housing support by the state. So I think there's still a fundamental mismatch between the scale of what the state should be doing in terms of building, in terms of providing an affordable and social supply, and what it's actually doing. And on the other hand, you look at the rents. I'm literally pulling my hair out for years going, why don't you just control the rents? And then you would stop this situation. But they've got themselves caught in this ideology and mantra, which is supply, supply, supply from the private sector. We don't want to do anything to deter that. But then you're caught in this situation.
Does the debate get too bogged down in ideology sometimes, Rory? And are kind of both sides of the debate, if we'll describe them that way, guilty of this at times?
I think that we do need to be careful about ideology, but I think we need to be honest about it as well. I think that, if you look at it, the supply, demand, and Barra, again, I'm sure would have, really good analysis on this as well. The housing system, our housing market, is not like a normal market. So this idea of, we stimulate supply, we get a supply, and we have this demand, supply will meet demand, and then it'll all be okay. It's not like that. There's so many complicating factors. And fundamentally, housing is a human need. It's a social need. It's not like a commodity. And so therefore, we have to, I think that the issue is the state itself needs to go, right, we want to ensure people have a home. So that means you have to, I think, put secondary within the market, investors, speculators, real estate funds. The primary thing should be the state ensuring people have an affordable home. But the mistake has been, I think, is that we've allowed too much of our housing system become an investment commodity. And that's not just by investors now. That is by Irish people as well, buying second homes, third homes, renting them out.
I don't want to kind of be guilty, Barra, of kind of rounding this off in a depressing, with a depressing thought. But I mean, if 300,000 new homes by the end of 2030 is not enough to meet our housing needs, and the government at the same time want to retrofit 500,000 homes over that period, and we know we don't have enough builders to do both of those combined, and we've got to do more, how likely is it we're going to solve this problem?
It's a really tough and challenging policy dilemma, but maybe on a more optimistic note, at the end of 2000s, more than 50% of those in retirement, those above the age of 65, were below the poverty line. And through sustained action over the next decade, by lifting the state pension and by, it really was the focus of social policy over that time, that poverty rate was brought down to less than 10%. So, the things can change. It'll take time, and it does require a range of policy solutions across the board. It's not just in one area, but it can be done. I think that maybe offers some prospect for things can improve, although it will take a long time, and we shouldn't understate just how challenging this is.